If you click this video because you're wondering if autistic people struggle with boundaries, then you're right, but it might not be why you think. Hey friends, I'm Mike, a late diagnosed autistic adult, and today we're going to talk about boundaries. We'll explore why traditional boundary setting often fails, especially in power imbalanced relationships, and what strategies actually work. If you search the internet for autism and boundary setting, you'll find many articles and pages written by mostly neurotypicals about how to set and enforce boundaries for the autistic person in their life. If you're an autistic person who has struggled with other people's demands, or sometimes abuse, you might find articles like this one on Psychology Today. How do we overcome this as people with autism, and how can those who love people with autism help them? I and many people in the autistic community prefer autistic person rather than person with autism. It makes it sound like it's a separate thing from the individual. Anyway, it all starts with self-acceptance. It starts with teaching those with autism that it is okay to say no to things that make them unhappy. It is okay to say no if we don't like something, even if what we don't like seems weird to neurotypicals. It also starts with realizing that just because you are autistic doesn't mean you are always wrong. We don't need to make neurotypicals happy, and sometimes they can be wrong. Articles like this feel right, and on an emotional level, it is right. Self-acceptance and building up one's adult ego state are healthy. And it's okay to say no to things that make us unhappy sometimes. But there's a massive problem with articles and comments like this. They completely ignore the reality of interpersonal dynamics. One simply cannot state our boundaries or utter them like a magical spell. Guess who's been playing a bit of Baldur's Gate 3 recently? Unfortunately, a boundary setting by simple utterances, statements, or lists of personal boundary lines or demands is the privilege of those with the upper hand in the power dynamic. You can only set boundaries when you have the means to enforce consequences for breaking them. People in positions of authority have that ability to enforce boundaries effectively because they can impose consequences. For many autistic individuals, especially those who may find themselves in dependent or vulnerable positions, this is not the case. Boundaries set by force are the most obvious. The need for militaries, particularly expeditionary ones, can be explained, in short, as simple boundary enforcement. Police are called law enforcement for the same reason. The larger the power dynamic is, the more effective the boundary setting can be. Consider the relationship between a parent and a child. In this dynamic, the parent typically holds the power due to their control over the child's basic needs, such as shelter, food, emotional support, things like that. I grew up in the 1980s. Punishment by being sent to my room without dinner. My mum would usually relent, by the way, and leave some food outside the door. That was pretty common for me, and not just me, but my peers as well. A fridge full of food and a number of food delivery options on my phone. My relationship with my parents is much better. This power imbalance can make it difficult for the child to set boundaries, even when they're necessary for their well-being. A few years later, I remember as a teenager, I needed privacy to study and unwind. I set a boundary with my parents by asking them, could you please knock before entering my bedroom? However, my dad used to enforce his boundaries by saying that he had the right to enter at any time and disregarded my request. This made me feel powerless and kind of resentful. Between my father and I, where was the boundary set? I had to be creative in ways to impose consequences. I remember one Christmas. I took the popping part, the banger, the thing that goes snap, out of some of our Christmas crackers, and I taped them over my bedroom door frame at about face height. It got me in trouble, but it put doubt in my dad's mind before he opened my bedroom door in the future. We can laugh about this now, but the moral of the story here is one has to sometimes be creative about how we enforce our boundaries. Technically, it was abusive, but I don't think my dad was using it intentionally as a psychological control mechanism. I think it's more likely that he had certain ideas about what fatherly roles were, and being in the military, this likely warped his sense of boundaries and order and power. People in positions of power may push boundaries for various reasons. They also might be doing it intentionally to test limits, to see how much control they can exert, see how much they can get away with. Or they might not even realize that they're overstepping due to a sense of entitlement or unawareness. This behavior can be particularly manipulative and harmful as it reinforces their dominance and leaves the less powerful individual feeling vulnerable and unheard. Boundaries are vitally important because they define what behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable from other people. For autistic people, I think they're even more important. In general, our view of the world and our needs differs from the typical majority, so ensuring our boundaries is so important. Our boundaries help us communicate our needs and limits, ensuring that we're treated with respect. Power isn't like we see it in shows like Game of Thrones.
You will do as I command, and you will marry Loras Tyrell, and put an end to the disgusting rumours about you once and for all.
This is a whole series on the topic of wielding power. People can be powerless on one hand, perhaps at work, but then powerful at home. We don't need to dwell on this. We all know the archetype of the abusive father, wait till your father gets home. And on the other hand, the internet trolls, more often than not, powerless young men who abuse people online in order to feel better about themselves, usually because they're also suffering from poor boundaries at home. Landlords and tenants. Unhealthy boundaries and power imbalances can lead to a range of negative outcomes. On the tenant, stress, anxiety, feeling of being out of control, your life, your living conditions, the way everything is. And the fact that somebody can just evict you or change the amount you have to pay, messing with your budget and expectations, well, that can actually diminish your sense of self-worth. It's crucial to recognise these dynamics and develop strategies to manage them effectively. We have rules and regulations and expectations on landlords based on how they can treat tenants. Tenants' rights exist as a result of this. Essentially, the power dynamic being the government has a bigger stick than the landlord, who has a slightly smaller stick than the tenant. It's not a great way to be. A landlord holds significant power over the tenant's living situation, including the ability to evict them or raise the rent. This power imbalance can make it challenging for tenants to assert their rights or set boundaries. For instance, a tenant might need repairs done in their apartment, but they feel hesitant to demand them because they fear retaliation or eviction. The landlord, on the other hand, might just ignore requests for maintenance, knowing that the tenant has limited options. This dynamic can create an environment where the tenant's boundaries are constantly violated and their living conditions suffer as a result. Sometimes someone who's aware of their power in a relationship might abuse it in this way in order to create more power and further tilt the balance in their favour. How do we respond to this? Well, our default option is fawning. In many cases, the person with less power may resort to people-pleasing or fawning behaviours to maintain peace and to avoid conflict. When I was at university studying computer science, the first year I had a part-time job working in Tesco. It was hard work that paid poorly, but I had a clear schedule, a rota, and work expectations. But it was physically exhausting. It was very tiring. I had a 3-mile walk to work, a physical job there and back. Public transport just wasn't so good back then. In the last years of my degree, now that I could drive, I applied for a job further away from home, but also near the same town that I was studying, this time working as a database administrator. It was a much better job, much less physically demanding, and also quite a lot less time travelling. On one Christmas Eve, my boss called me. He was a well-known narcissist, self-described himself as an asshole. He phoned me and said that I had to come into work on Christmas morning, saying that I had to help him back up some servers or something similar. This was back in the days before remote working was common. He wanted me to travel in the winter on Christmas Day. He wanted me to throw away my plans. He wanted to really push the boundaries, see how far he could push me, I think. The servers were on an automated schedule. Anyway, they were managed by someone else. This isn't really the point, though. He insisted, giving me no logical reason at all. So I found myself fawning, and I agreed that I'd keep my phone with me and he could text me if he needed anything remotely. He had control over me, as I needed the job, and as an unqualified undergrad at the time, I couldn't get a better role anywhere else and didn't want to have to go back to working in a busy retail store under those fluorescent lights again. So I put up with it. In situations like this, people often resort to people-pleasing and fawning as coping mechanisms. Fawning is a trauma response where one attempts to avoid conflict and gain approval by appeasing others. Of course, I know this now, but I wished I knew before and understood these behaviours when I was younger. Understanding these behaviours can help us recognise when we're being manipulated and take steps to protect ourselves. A common phrase used in the autism community is PDA, or pathological demand avoidance, perhaps better rephrased as pervasive drive for autonomy. I don't think I have PDA profile because the P, the pathological, seems entirely rational to me. For over 20 years, I've been a freelancer, I've been self-employed, an IT contractor, running my own business, and I've learnt a lot about business and human behaviour during this time. Whilst there are so many disadvantages to going it alone, especially in dealing with larger businesses, it does give me a few options that weren't available if I were in employment. I don't get holiday pay or sickness cover, and sometimes I don't even get paid at all. But it does give me the ability to leverage power and autonomy in ways that employees cannot. For instance, many clients just constantly attempt to push my boundaries, and I can see it coming. I had one just yesterday, after we completed a job's requirements, only to get an email out of hours asking for more. My instinct is to think, okay, and just comply and do as I'm asked, and over-explain sometimes. I actually started to type out my response and eventually just deleted it. Sometimes I've worked with people in client organizations that then offer me work, which I then do, but their manager or director hadn't signed off on it and disputes my invoice. Sometimes I've worked with people who intentionally argue, a bit like the person who tries to get the dinner for free at a restaurant. I've had many hundreds of clients over the last 20 years, and I've spotted some consistent patterns. The only time that I felt like I was in control and playing the same game with the same rules was after I learned about boundaries. I might respond to them during office hours, setting out a brief proposal to allocate their work into a new formal package of work. But before this happens, they'll have to pay their outstanding bills first. This is because I have a boundary of allowing a certain amount of credit to build up, and no more. And then they'll have to formally agree to the new work. This is also because I have a boundary of needing explicit requirements stated in writing before I can deliver on the additional requests. Sometimes that means the extra demands just find themselves fizzling away. Sometimes it also turns into work that pays well, on time, and everybody's happy. All because of boundaries. This reminds me of another situation where I tried to set boundaries with someone who constantly texted me. When I didn't reply immediately, they then escalated by calling the police. Now, this kind of reaction shows how important it is to manage our responses and set boundaries carefully. If you want to hear more about these kinds of experiences and how to deal with them, join my Patreon for extended content and Discord for more in-depth discussions. Let's leave it there. Even from an abuser's perspective, they may not be doing such things intentionally, but it may well just be them. When you're playing a video game and your character is under a negative effect, having a party member or teammate outside the negative area of effect is so useful and might just help you win the game. I can't emphasize enough why having friends and outside perspective is so important. Being able to get a second opinion from somebody who's outside the area of effect, if you will, of any power dynamic is so helpful. Before I go into the tips and solutions, if you find my content helpful in any way, please click the like button and consider subscribing and stimming the notification bell for more content. Solution option 1 is direct confrontation. Now, this is where a lot of advice lies. A lot of advice that I've seen online says to directly state your objections as if the other person who holds the most power will somehow respect your boundaries and leave you alone. Yeah, that's got a history of working well. It usually results in escalation or retaliation. If you aren't aware that you hold some power and have some enforceable consequences, then direct confrontation will almost certainly fail to work. It's almost dangerous to try and state boundaries when you both know that you've got no way to enforce them. That sort of weakens your position and makes you get taken less seriously. There's also another psychological factor that plays into the dynamics of confrontation. If you push back, you can actually make yourself rewarding to be beaten. Strange, right? But it's similar to the way that we don't all play video games on the easiest difficulty all of the time. It's why we enjoy playing ranked games, or whether chess or Call of Duty. It doesn't matter. Same thing. Research has shown that the brain's reward system is highly activated when overcoming a challenging opponent. A study published in the journal Neuron found that the nucleus accumbens, a core part of the brain's reward circuitry, is more active when individuals face and overcome difficult challenges, providing a stronger sense of accomplishment and reward.
After all, David killed Goliath with a pebble.
It's significantly more rewarding to take someone down who's at or higher than your level. Conversely, trying to fly under the radar, disappearing, not taking up space, appearing too weak can be just as dangerous. Think about a workplace where an employee constantly agrees to unreasonable demands from their boss. If the employee never stands up for themselves, the boss might take advantage of this perceived weakness and continually push more work onto the employee. So how do we solve this? Solution option 2, creating mental distance. You may not have the power to control others, but you do have the power to control yourself. Don't be reactive. If the other person is pushing and testing your boundaries and they're doing it intentionally, it's because they need a reaction from you. By reacting to people, you are rewarding the behavior, so you'll receive more of it. I can actually hear you now in the comments saying, don't be silly, it's far too difficult to do. I can't do that, I'm at school, I can't do this, I'm at work, you don't understand my situation. Let me put it this way. There's a technique called grey rock or grey man. It's one of the top strategies used by captured SAS commandos when they've been captured and they're being interrogated. They are at the mercy of their captors for their basic needs, food, water, safety. They have no leverage whatsoever. This SAS soldier says, quote, I try to be the grey man, not too aggressive and not too submissive. You want to stay mentally alert, but let him think that he's on top of you. We aren't all in mortal danger. Usually boundary pushing is more of a chronic problem over a longer period of time and not a shorter one over an intense period of time. Think parents, teachers, bosses at work, romantic partners, some types of friendships, that sort of thing. For these things, try to insert time into the situation where you can. You don't need to respond immediately to every request, every demand, and every interaction. I used to believe that it was healthy to have my email inbox at inbox 0. I now take the line that the world won't end if I haven't dealt with every piece of correspondence or message that I receive. I used to never go to bed without clearing every single item, getting my inbox to 0 unread emails and unmanaged emails, no support tickets. Look, it's unmanageable longer term. It's like playing table tennis, but your opponents are using machine guns. And it teaches people that you'll always respond to them politely and promptly. I've had customers, by the way, seriously get angry with me when they don't get a response to a support ticket request that they've called urgent at 9 p.m. at night. And the only reason they're getting angry is because I've let them become accustomed to prompt responses, personal ones from me 24/7. And this sets a new expectation. No one actually did that to me. I've pushed my own boundaries well beyond the fawning zone. So give yourself some time and some space. Not every demand carries the same urgency, and maybe something that's urgent to someone else that they're pressing on you might not be urgent to you at all. Solution option 3, flexibility. Be like water. Bruce Lee has some advice for conflicts.
Be water, my friend.
Be like water making its way through cracks. Do not be assertive, but adjust to the object, and you shall find a way around or through it. If nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. Sometimes you may need to adjust your boundaries. Be flexible, not inflexible. Say your boss asks you to help out on another project in addition to your current workload. You could react defensively or give perhaps a fawning response. You could say no, but a better solution might be to say, I can help with this project, but I'll need additional time to complete my other tasks. Sometimes employers will tacitly encourage people to work through their lunch breaks. It's like an hour of free labour a day. But you may need to state this as a boundary. I need to take my lunch breaks at the scheduled time to maintain my productivity and well-being. Implying that your employer simply has to care about your well-being, even if they secretly don't, they will need to appear to. You need to enforce your boundaries and follow through on any consequences consistently. If I'm constantly asked to work overtime without notice, I'll need to discuss a more manageable workload, for instance. When I'm consulting, I have more options open to me. It's like leveling up in an RPG and unlocking some higher power spells and abilities. But this still doesn't stop many clients from trying to push boundaries anyway. Sometimes it's worth calling them out on it, but taking a page from Bruce Lee's model, there's usually a hidden opportunity. There is a reason for every behavior, and sometimes, if you can identify the hidden pressure or need behind the outwardly obvious demand, you can address that need directly, like water through cracks.
Water never grows stale, so you gotta just keep on flowing.
Solution option 4, emotional regulation. The fastest person to respond with the wittiest comeback doesn't change the dynamic, even if it makes for entertaining television. Deep within our brains, the fearful reactive limbic system, which was incredibly helpful during our evolutionary past, it's a section of our brains that we share with crocodiles and reptiles, that's in control. It's a survival instinct. It's why we're still here as a species today, but it's not helpful in these situations. Learning to regulate your emotions and resist the urge to act immediately can give you the time and space you need to respond in a more constructive and beneficial way. It doesn't come easily, but it does require practice. It's also possibly the main reason why learning how to resolve conflicts in relationships is such an important skill to have. And one of the main techniques is simply to wait. Wait for the negative energy to pass a while before offering a considered response. If a colleague criticizes your work unfairly, instead of immediately defending yourself, take a moment to pause and reflect before responding. Make it a rule of yours. It works even in high-pressure environments like courtrooms and filmed events. A few years ago, I was on the panel at a climate change debate, trying very hard to regulate my responses to some obvious bullshit. See if you can spot this undiagnosed, younger autistic AF trying to regulate and respond in real time.
The so-called experts telling us that we're on the verge of catastrophe and we're all going to get wiped out. If you get 1 million plastic bags entering the oceans every day, which is what has been claimed, then I think that who's responsible for that? Carbon dioxide is plant food. You reduce your carbon dioxide emissions and you get lower greenery, not more. You get lower food production. So the solution yes, but not on the climate. Not on the climate.
Yeah, but if you're saying to me that the corporations are
ruining the planet,
are ruining the planet, humans, they are humans, are having an effect.
Yes,
so it's the corporations.
Not on climate change.
Mike, can I give you a microphone and go over to you to comment?
Sorry, sir, what was your name?
Marshall Anthony.
Anthony, I'm Mike. So was the scientist you're referring to known as Moncton by any chance?
It's possible. I didn't bother collecting all the names.
Okay, so to answer your points, I'm trying to remember them, so correct me if I'm wrong. There are about 7 or 8. The first one is the scientists. So the International Panel on Climate Change is a UN organisation, and it's made up of 193 countries, correct me if I'm wrong, panel. If I'm wrong, it's like by 1 or 2, but it's 193 countries. Each one of those signs off on the evidence individually, every single one. Any of those country scientists has the right to veto. So if this happened, they'd be like, no, not happening. Their 6th report is actually not out yet, although a few weeks ago the summary was released. The summary states that in order to have the planet essentially at 1.3 Celsius degree warming, we need to rapidly and immediately decarbonise our economy, which is quite a big ask. So we're likely to get more than that. And just so you know what that looks like, can I ask how many people in here are over the age of 50? Okay. Seriously, Corelli? So I'll move this way. Sorry. So the freak weather event that happens once every 50 years, if you can remember it from your childhoods possibly, that drought, the wildfires, the strong winters, for example, any sort of energy event that had a lot of energy in it, that 1 in 50 at 1.4 degrees turns into 39.4 out of every 50 years. So that's why it's so important that we do something about it. Whether we argue it's man-made or not, that's just the way it is. I don't know if we're going to talk about man-made stuff or not, but perhaps one moderator will tell me not to. But yeah, there's a lot of sort of conflicting, stuff on the internet, as you'll find about anything, whether we're talking about climate change, or if we're talking about government policy, or if we're talking about Twin Towers or COVID, or whether Elvis is dead. But there's going to be, conflicting ideas on all sorts of things. But the idea is we're working with consensus. And the consensus is 193 countries, of which they have their own scientific panels. There would have to be one hell of a conspiracy to work with that many people.
Can I just reply to that for 30 seconds? Number one, I wouldn't believe anything the United Nations said about anything. Did you hear that? I wouldn't believe anything the United Nations said about anything. You see, but you only ever hear about one side of it, you never hear the other side.
Yeah, all I would say is this is a climate change conspiracy. I'm happy to take it off.
No, conspiracy.
No, I just mean that it's from what's called the Templeton Foundation. It's Professor Moncton, who isn't a professor at all. I think he's a professor of nutrition. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm happy to take this. I don't know how we want to do the debate. Do you want me to be quiet now?
I don't want to just sort of get stuck on a one-to-one, because many of you have got points of view. So,
solution option 5, managing guilt. I wanted to mention guilt in this video because it's a really common manipulation tool. If you feel guilty for saying no to a friend's request for help, try to remind yourself that it's okay to prioritize your own needs and that saying no does not make you a bad friend. I struggle with taking time for a break. To me, resting is being unproductive. It's to be avoided. It's not healthy. And it's something I'm now working on. Sometimes to be our most productive selves, we need to stop and recharge once in a while. Sometimes when I'm hyper-focusing on something, I can forget to meet my basic needs. If this is you too, this is your reminder to take a break from your computer, or your phone, and drink some water. I now accept that some people may be upset with me when I enforce my boundaries, but I accept that their reactions are not my responsibility. And you can do this too, at least in situations where you cannot neatly state your boundary and its consequences, and you have to use one of the softer techniques to manage other people. You know that their negative reactions are not your responsibility. They are responsible for themselves and you for you. I've written this from an autistic perspective, but in this video on screen, we explored times that autistic people can be boundary pushers too, and the link is in the description and on screen. Also, this week on Patreon, I'm answering AMAs, and of course, hanging out with all the lovely patrons on Discord. It's a great supportive community. Those who wanted badges, they start getting sent out next week. Take care, bye!